From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
Matt, we've said it before on the show, regardless of whether or not you live in the United States yourself, regardless of your personal stance on politics, policy, law enforcement, or even pharmaceutical companies, if you're hearing this, you are being affected by the consequences of a multi-generational war. It's not a war on any specific country, any specific person, even specific ideologies. It's a war on a concept, a war on substances that themselves have no goals, belief, or ideology. You, me, everyone. We're all affected by the war on drugs. But how did we get here? What led us to this point? Where are we collectively now? Where will we be in the future? To answer this question, we wanted to go directly to one of the leaders in this conversation, in this field, Ethan Nadelman. Ethan, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. We're quite excited to speak with you.
Hey, my pleasure, Ben. Matt, it's great to see you. Great to meet you, Ben.
Yes. Oh, yes. So some people may know you from your podcast, Psychoactive. Many others will know your face and your voice from a TED Talk that you gave back in the day. That's got, I don't even know how many millions of views at this point. But a vast majority of the people, if a little bell rings when they hear Ethan Nadelman, it's because you are the founder of the Drug Policy Alliance. And I just wonder if you could give us maybe a short rundown of who you are, because I feel like I can't introduce you properly.
Sure, man. I'm happy to do that. Well, so I basically spent most of my adult life working to end the war on drugs. And now I'm going to be 65 in a few months. So I've been working on this since my 20s. So, I mean, basically the real synopsis of it is, graduate school, I started studying international drug control, got a security clearance from the State Department, wrote classified report on drug-related money laundering, interviewed drug enforcement agents from the U.S. and other countries all around the world, wrote some books about this issue, became a professor at Princeton in the late 80s, right when the drug war was going absolutely crazy, like Mccarthyism on steroids. And I sort of stood up and said, this is crazy. Got a few 15 minutes of fame. There was an emerging drug policy reform movement in those days. A few years later, I get a call out of the blue from a philanthropist and financier named George Soros, who was interested in this issue. We kind of hit it off. So I left Princeton University, started up this institute in 94. Eventually, in 2000, it merges with another organization, becomes the Drug Policy Alliance. I ran that for 17 years until I stepped down about 4 years ago. At that point, Drug Policy Alliance was the biggest and leading drug policy reform organization, not just in the U.S., but around the world. And during the course of that, it meant we got deeply involved in things like ballot initiatives to legalize marijuana, first for medical purposes and then more broadly. We got deeply involved in trying to roll back the role of the drug war in mass incarceration. And our other major priority was making a serious commitment to treating drug use and addiction as a health issue, not a criminal issue, which meant everything to trying to reduce the spread of AIDS through needle exchange programs, to overdose prevention, to introducing Americans to cutting-edge ideas that were being implemented in Europe and elsewhere.
Wow. Okay, so there was so much there. so many little things that I want to jump on. And Ben, I'm sorry, I don't mean to just take over for a second here, but you threw out the name George Soros. He's one of these guys that just has so many rumors circulating about him because of his, obvious wealth and power. But like, what was that interaction like? I'm so curious personally about that, because I didn't know there was a connection there.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you, Matt. I mean, with George, when I first got the call in the summer of '92, almost 30 years ago, He was a guy, wasn't that well known. He was more known for his finance, but he'd been the key philanthropist funding the dissidents and the opposition to socialist dictatorship in former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And what had happened was communism, communism had fallen much more quickly than he or anybody expected. And he had been the key private individual helping bring about its downfall. He was very committed to the ideals of an open society, right? Fighting totalitarianism from the left and the right. And so he then began asking him the question, well, he'd always thought that America was the model of what an open society is. But it now seemed, the question was what in America was inconsistent with open society ideals. And basically one of the first things that hit him between the eyes was the war on drugs. And so he reached out, and, at that point I was a young professor at Princeton, but I was already the most prominent person probably in the world speaking out against the drug war and in favor of looking at things like legalization and decriminalization. And so we got together and we hit it off. And it's funny now to think that, he's now identified as this radical left funder. But in point of fact, when I first met George, I think his politics, in fact, he said so, they were more almost like liberal Republican, or what was known in the days as, you guys may not know, but Scoop Jackson was a famous Democrat who, very anti-communist, but kind of progressive on social issues. And George really identified as a kind of Scoop Jackson human rights Democrat or maybe liberal Republican. And very much not identified in the way he is now. And so he and I essentially developed a partnership where, he agreed to back my starting an organization and funding grants programs and doing all sorts of things like that. And in terms of his current reputation, that really began, I'd say, around 2003. When George was simply horrified at the Bush administration's war on terror and all the implications of this thing. He saw what we were doing with the invasion of Iraq. He saw all the rhetoric around the anti-terrorism stuff as really being over the top and not reflective of open society ideals. And it's at that point where he started to get much more politically involved in supporting Democrats. Until that point, he hadn't been much of a player. But if you jump forward now, he's become a bit more progressive in his views, but what's really gone on is the demonization of Soros by the right. It's notable that if you look, it's not just the people on the right in the United States who demonize Soros. It's Putin, right? It's what's his name? The president of Hungary. It's the right-wing authoritarian dictators around the world who hate Soros because he's the one supporting the Orange Revolution and the other revolutions in the former Soviet Union. He's the one fighting for freedom. He's the number one funder of human rights in the world. And fortunately for me, because of, I think, our relationship, because of his commitment, even though his support for drug policy reform has only represented maybe 2% of the $1 billion a year that he and his foundation are giving away, it's always loomed large in his consciousness and especially in the earlier years, I think in the public perceptions of him as well. So, I think he's now 91. He's still going. He's an extraordinary human being who's going to go down in history for, really fighting for open society ideals. And, why he's been demonized, I think what happened is part of it may be the name, Soros, is like a provocative name and everybody can remember it. And I think, sending out anti-Soros stuff and some of it's also playing on anti-Semitism, the notion of the Jewish capitalist, the Jewish communist, it goes back to the protocols of the elders of Zion, that famous anti-Semitic tract of the late 19th, early 20th century. So there's some of that going on. It's a shame. But if you look at the good, books are being written about all the good he's done, and it's really extraordinary around the world.
And the Koch brothers hate him, which is always a good sign to me.
Well, I'll tell you, Ben, it's a bit complicated because there are issues like ending the drug war and criminal justice reform and some foreign policy issues where actually George and the Koch brothers, well, now it's no longer the brothers, now it's basically Charles since David died, where they actually see eye to eye on some things. So on a lot of the big issues, they're opposed to one another. But I'll tell you, there was a moment, one of the other famous right-wingers is Grover Norquist, The famous anti-tax, let's get government so small we can strangle in a bathtub kind of libertarian approach. Mm-hmm. But Grover became an ally of mine on ending the drug war because he hates the drug war coming from a libertarian perspective. And I landed up arranging for George Soros to speak to Grover Norquist, Wednesday morning breakfast group of, leading right-wingers in America. So I mean, part of what I've enjoyed has been, this kind of bringing the left and the right together in behalf of a good cause like ending the war on drugs.
That's an important point too, I think, because it is something that requires massive collective action. Growing up in the generation of people like Matt or myself, the war on drugs was normalized, right? Mm-hmm. You were born into this ongoing conflict with a lot of propaganda. We had programs like DARE in public schools and so on. We also had I think a lot of people in our generation, maybe a lot of people listening today, just hear the phrase war on drugs and immediately have some kind of vague associations, but don't really understand the genesis of the situation that the U.S. entered into. Earlier, you said, when describing this situation, the war on drugs, you said McCarthyism on steroids in a specific era of the war on drugs. And that really, to me, that so astutely nails the situation that so many people grew up in. But I think a lot of people have never investigated the origins of this situation, the genesis of the war on drugs. And could you, Ethan, tell us and the audience a little bit about how this all evolved? Like, it's a well-known historical fact that for a time, things like marijuana or cocaine or opiates were legal, right? You could buy an over-the-counter medicinal beverage to, calm a child's toothache. And now those same sorts of substances can lead to draconian prison sentences and things like mandatory minimums. So how did the U.S. evolve from that earlier point to the current day?
Sure. Well, Ben, I'll try to make it as a thumbnail sketch as much as possible. Basically, if you think about it, as you said, late 19th century, cocaine, opiates, opium, even heroin that is created in the late 1890s, cannabis, they're basically legal throughout the United States and many other countries. And then the first prohibitions come about not because there's new evidence of their harms. I mean, that plays a small role. It's more about because of public perceptions of who uses or who is perceived to use these substances. So nobody was going to criminalize, all these over-the-counter opiates. It was called laudanum, this liquid opium, so long as most of the consumers were middle-class white women, in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, because nobody wanted to put, their auntie or grandma behind bars. But when opiates become associated with the Chinese migrants coming in, working long hours on the railroads and the mines, what have you, that's when these kind of xenophobic, racist fears become dominant, in the media, and the fear that what are these yellow men, these Chinamen going to do to our precious white women, luring them into opium addiction and turning them into sex slaves in our opium dens. Same thing with cocaine. Right? Cocaine widely used. Coca-Cola had cocaine in it until 1900. So far as we know, the problems with Coca-Cola addiction in the 1890s were no worse with cocaine in it than they are now with caffeine in it. Right? But when cocaine gets to be perceived with deviant groups, and especially with blacks in the South, and the fear that these black men would snort this white powder and forget their proper place in society and go out and do bad things to our precious white women, that's when you get cocaine prohibitions. And ditto with cannabis. Right? It wasn't a big deal, but when it gets linked in the popular imagination with Mexican Americans, Mexican migrants in the Southwest and the West in the second and third decades of the 20th century, that's when you get the cannabis prohibitions. So you have some kind of early stages of the war on drugs going on, although back then, of course, the big war on drugs was alcohol prohibition, the temperance movement, the 18th Amendment banning alcohol in 1919, and then the whole revolt against against that, leading to the only amendment in American history to be repealed, alcohol prohibition by the 21st Amendment in 1933. So we had these periodic wars on drugs. The one that people oftentimes point to is Richard Nixon, declaring 50 years ago drugs being public enemy number one. And that was, there were concerns around heroin, but it was also part of his, fears around the hippies and weed and LSD and Timothy Leary and all this sort of stuff. And that was the beginnings of the war on drugs. But then when in the 70s, there's this little period where everybody gets chill. And that's the period when I come of age, right? I'm only 12 when the 60s end, but I'm graduating college at the end of the 70s. And I remember being in college in the late 70s, and I went first to McGill in Montreal, then to Harvard. And, it was cool. People would get high. Nobody was all flipped out. Cocaine was kind of around, but it wasn't a big issue. There was this kind of sensible period. Jimmy Carter proposes, a federal law decriminalizing marijuana. People are talking sense. But then what happens is, an anti-parents movement starts up in the late 70s. There are legitimate concerns about 1 in 10 high school kids getting high every day, and nobody likes, high school kids waking and baking. And so you have the beginnings, the Democrats starting getting fearful, and then Reagan comes in. And Reagan starts to pick up on the war on drugs and the rhetoric and see the political advantage and being able to kind of, the dog whistles, connecting it with fears around black people and crime without actually sounding outright like a racist. And then crack cocaine. 1980s, Len Bias, a famous basketball player, dies of a cocaine overdose. And then there's a bipartisan, let's step up the penalties. And that's 1986 is when I really begin to date the modern era of the war on drugs.
And that's penalties for selling or for possessing or for
both,
for all things?
Matt. For both. I mean, it's basically what happens is that's when they start to introduce penalties at the federal level, and the states do the same thing of basically saying cocaine possession can put you into prison. Maybe we'll give you a shot at treatment, but if you don't stop, you're going to prison. And you get penalties for, sometimes 1, but sometimes 5 years, even more for simple cocaine possession of small amounts. And for people selling it, they're introducing penalties of 10, 20 years. It's crazy. By the late 1980s, it is the number one. 50% of Americans in public opinion polls are saying drugs is the number one threat to America. It's that sort of craziness. And marijuana, which everybody getting chill about, and it's getting tied up in the whole war on cocaine. And it's not just older people, it's younger people, right? In the late 70s, I think 50% of all college freshmen were in favor of legalizing marijuana. By the late 80s, it's down to 16%. So, I started teaching at Princeton in 1987, and I'm amazed at how conservative my kids are when they're taking a seminar with me on drug policy, and half of them have never even smoked a joint. It's a whole transition what goes on. And when I use the phrase McCarthyism on steroids, well, you think, McCarthyism was about the fear of communism, right? The fear of the Russians invading us, the fear of communist spies. But the fact of the matter is the Russians were not lapping at our borders, and there was not a communist spy under every bed. But you could persuade Americans to become hysterical and engage in these witch hunts where people would be fired for past associations or not signing up to loyalty oaths. Well, war on drugs, yes, there was a real problem with drugs coming from abroad and people getting addicted. And yes, there was a problem with drug dealers domestically and fears around kids. But in point of fact, the realities of the issue, it was not the kind of threat that was being depicted in the popular imagination. And what happened is you had right-wing Republicans, most notoriously the first drug czar, a guy named William Bennett, under the first President Bush, who see this is a vehicle in which the right wing can play on the fears of middle-class American parents and get them to embrace these draconian policies. And the Democrats, who don't want to be accused of being soft on crime or soft on drugs, and some of the old-timers, most especially a famous Democrat back then, Tip O'Neill, the Massachusetts liberal congressman who was Speaker of the House, they all join on board. So we get this bipartisan war on drugs, and all of a sudden, America's prison population, which had been sort of around the global average back in the 70s, it goes from 500,000 people behind bars in 1980 to 2.3 million by the early 2000s. 4% of the world's population, we got 20% of the world's incarcerated population. We're locking up black people in a way that makes South Africa under apartheid look like nothing. We're competing with the Soviet gulags when it comes to rates of incarceration of black people, right? So we embrace this policy of drug testing the entire society, trying to use drug testing in schools, in the workplace, firing people not for being high on job, but just for having smoked a joint over the weekend. We're locking up people ruthlessly. We're treating drug dealers as if they were rapists and murderers. So that's the war on drugs that, and that's the thing I've been spending much of my life trying to repeal and roll back ever since.
Man, and you've spoken with some very interesting people for your show Psychoactive on this very topic. And, I don't want to focus too hard in on the war on drugs because there's so many things we could discuss here. But I think maybe your discussion with Larry Krasner, the DA, I think he's the DA in Philadelphia. Is that correct?
That's right.
He had some interesting things to say, and you guys actually had some background just about how, as a district attorney, you can help to shape how some of these laws, even if they're on the books, how they're actually enforced. Can you just tell me a little bit about what you guys discussed when it comes to the current, how some of these drug laws are enforced right now?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, Matt, we oftentimes people say, follow the money and that'll explain the drug war. And, there's some truth to that. Private prison corporations and, prison guards unions are fighting for their jobs and police departments wanting more money and all this sort of stuff. But actually, the most venal element of the war on drugs has oftentimes been the prosecutors, the district attorneys, the U.S. attorneys, right, the federal and state and local prosecutors. And that's not about money. That's about power. And that's about power in terms of, the tougher the laws are, the more you can coerce low-level, people who are picked up on drug possession or low-level dealing to plead guilty, sometimes even if they're not, right? The more also in terms of that interpersonal relationship between the prosecutor and the defense attorney, it just grossly shifts the balance of power. A lot of prosecutors want to run for public office. And so, getting on the whole drug war bandwagon is great for them. And so they have really been some of the most unaccountable champions of the war on drugs, worse than the police chiefs, worse than any right-wing judges, worse than you name it. Right. And Larry Krasner, the Philadelphia DA, is really one of the leaders in a new wave of progressive prosecutors, basically saying the drug war is bullshit. Filling our jails and prisons with tons of low-level people engaged in low-level crimes of, drug selling doesn't make any sense. We need to treat the drug issue primarily as a health issue. Law enforcement is not a key part of the solution. And so Larry Krasner has very bravely been doing this in Philadelphia, and I was delighted because a lot of these progressive prosecutors, when they start moving forward, if there's all of a sudden a spike in crime, they could get elected out of office. But Krasner, easily won re-election in Philadelphia, fairly recently. So, he's a good guy. Some of the other guests, like, Senator Schumer, he was one of the real drug warriors, but now we see him kind of co-sponsoring a marijuana legalization bill. Or the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, who's been there for like 18 years, Nora Volkow. I really saw her as kind of kinder, gentler face of the drug war establishment, who had run away from me, in all our previous encounters. But now she was willing to be on the show because things are changing, right? So there is this evolution with good guys like Krasner and other prosecutors like him and police chiefs stepping up and saying we need a different way. And then some of the old bad guys beginning to change their tune because the public is changing.